All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome you to this 90-minute webinar. It's the first in a new series JDI is doing looking at vulnerable and underserved populations. The focus of today's webinar is incarcerated men of color who are survivors of sexual abuse, with the goal of increasing victim advocates' knowledge, skills, and abilities to serve male survivors in confinement settings. My name is Christian Vian, and I am an operations officer at JDI's LA office. In that role, I provide research and administrative assistance to JDI's training and technical assistance programs for corrections agencies and victim advocacy programs nationwide. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Just Detention International is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. JDI carries out its mission by working with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe, promoting public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention, and supporting incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. The core principle underlying all of JDI's work is that no matter what a crime a person may have committed, rape is not part of the penalty. This webinar is made possible thanks to the Office on Violence Against Women. So before we begin, I want to go over some webinar logistics. We're going to have time at the end of the webinar to answer questions, but please feel free to submit them throughout the webinar. You could submit questions in the questions box as you see circled in red there. And on that note, there will be a question coming up later in the webinar that will need to be answered with the question box. These questions will only be seen by the moderator and staff. The webinar will be recorded, and a closed caption recording will be posted on JDI's website in the coming weeks, along with a discussion guide with resources. Today's training will include stories about sexual violence, including stories from survivors. So please, practice self-care during this presentation. And now I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Cynthia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Cynthia Totten, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director in Just Detention International's Washington, D.C. office. I lead JDI's National Training and Technical Assistance Program, supporting the work of state and tribal sexual assault coalitions, victim advocates, corrections officials, and funding administrators to ensure that incarcerated survivors have access to crisis services. Additionally, I work directly with corrections agencies on adopting and implementing policies that keep prisoners safe from sexual abuse. As Christian mentioned, today's webinar will focus on incarcerated men of color who are survivors of sexual abuse. This is actually the first in a 6-part series of webinars for advocates on working with the most vulnerable and underserved incarcerated survivors. For many of you who are rape crisis counselors, a daunting aspect of working with incarcerated survivors is providing services to populations that are distinct from those who traditionally seek assistance from community-based centers and who are acutely underserved. For reasons we'll discuss in more depth today, incarcerated men of color are one of those especially marginalized groups. And the community, the degree to which advocates provide services for men, and especially men of color, may vary greatly. This can be in part because, broadly speaking, women may be more likely to see rape crisis services as being available to and for them, and some programs may not have adequate training or resources for male survivors. This picture may be different where a program has done significant outreach to communities of color, and of course, it will vary depending on the demographics of the surrounding area. We know that many survivor advocacy programs already struggle to make services truly accessible to all survivors, including those with disabilities or mental illness, and men of color, and other underserved communities. A key goal of this webinar is to increase advocates' comfort in working with traditionally underserved survivors, and by doing so, increase their comfort with applying those skills to helping all incarcerated survivors. So in addition to men of color, We'll be looking as part of this six-part series at LGBTQ incarcerated survivors, those who have mental illness or disability, those who are survivors of sexual abuse perpetrated by women, and those who are deaf or hard of hearing. You'll see the announcements for each of these webinars in the coming weeks. In fact, the one on LGBTQ or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning or queer survivors is coming up on April 17th, next week. So please try to tune in to as many of these as you can. They will also be archived as well, along with the discussion guides. So as I began to explain, male survivors of color are one of those populations that many rape crisis counselors tend to be unfamiliar with providing services for. Yet, given who is incarcerated in the United States, it's critical that victim advocates providing services in detention settings are comfortable and prepared to work with African American, Latino, and other men of color. So the objectives of today's webinar are to strengthen advocates' capacity to provide services for incarcerated male survivors of color, and you'll see these objectives on your screen, help advocates better understand the ways that the experiences and needs of incarcerated male survivors of color differ from other survivors they have worked with in the community and in detention due to their identity and custody status, prepare advocates to use the PREA standards to advocate for these and all incarcerated survivors' safety and dignity. So let's take a look at our agenda for the day. Or for the session. We'll take a look first briefly at race, incarceration, victimization, and men. Who's behind bars in the United States, both in terms of adults and youth, pertinent statistics on sexual abuse in detention, as well as in the community. We'll move on to looking at understanding and addressing trauma among boys and men of color and the connections with the criminal justice system. We'll hear from Richard Smith, who's the national director of a program called Healing Works at an organization called Common Justice. From there, we'll hear from Mona Brown, a victim advocate who has worked with many incarcerated male survivors of color at corrections facilities in California. She'll talk with us about considerations for victim services provision for this population. We'll then move into a question and answer session where you'll have a chance to ask questions of today's speakers and learn about other resources. And also a word about language. You may hear the term inmate or prisoner used interchangeably today to refer to people in custody. You'll also hear the term incarcerated survivor used to refer to someone who's in a detention setting and has been sexually victimized at some point in their lives, though not necessarily while incarcerated and not necessarily in their current facility. Remember that the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards call for incarcerated people to have access to services, including communication with outside advocates in as confidential a manner as possible, without regard to when or where that sexual abuse or sexual harassment occurred. And then the term men of color. So when we use that term, I'm referring broadly to men who are Black or African American, Latinos, Native Americans, Asians, and multiracial men. It's a term that emphasizes the common experiences of systemic racism, and many find it preferable to terminology like minorities. Of course, not everyone who is a member of these various racial groups identifies with the term people of color, so it's also critical to remember that any individual person has the right to determine how they prefer to be identified. Great. So we wanted to start, before jumping into the webinar, to pause and ask all of you a couple of questions just to get a sense of where you and your programs are in terms of providing services to incarcerated male survivors of color. So first, can you tell us, and notice that we're just asking about men here, not men of color specifically, can you tell us, have you provided victim services for incarcerated men? And we ask this question because in many cases, we're asking it this way because you may not always know the race of who you're working with or who is requesting services, particularly when those services are sort of provided by phone or letter. And some of you may only have provided services in women's facilities thus far. So Christian has put the slide up, or the poll up for you. Please respond and select one, yes or no. And we'll give you a minute or so to do that. Okay. Christian, do you think they've, okay. Great. Okay, so here we see the results. So we've got 64% of those who responded saying that you have indeed provided victim services for incarcerated men, and 36%, so a pretty sizable percentage, who have not done so. Okay, so let's ask another related question then is, are your program staff culturally competent to address the needs and concerns of male survivors of color? Thinking about, the staff in your program, the approach that your program takes, do you believe that the staff at your program possess the cultural competency to address the needs and concerns, not just of male survivors, but male survivors of color? And then you'll see here, you can go ahead and answer that either yes, we are fully prepared, or no, we need to strengthen our capacity in some way. We'll give you a minute to respond to that. And then Christian will tally the results. Okay, so it sounds like we've hit on something. When you look at these results, we have 31% of folks saying that they are fully prepared, or their programs are fully prepared and culturally competent to address the needs and concerns of male survivors of color, but 70%, 69% saying, no, we need to strengthen our capacity. So hopefully that's something that we can help you with today. And then for all of those, that 69% who said no, can you describe briefly in the chat box your concerns about your readiness to provide culturally competent services for male survivors of color? So it can be very informal, very brief. It can be something as simple as training, or more diversity on staff, or kind of whatever it is that you think would be useful for you in terms of strengthening program capacity and cultural competency, so that we can just see some examples of what your sense is of what the needs are. And hopefully everyone is able to put an answer into the chat box, or the question box. And then Christian, you can definitely chime in if you think folks need any guidance or reminder of how to do that.
Sure. Again, folks, it's going to be the question box that you see in the lower right portion of your control panel. And we have some trickling in, which is great. One is a major gap for us is that most of the staff, all but one, are women.
Okay.
And as a counselor, how do you cope when you can't really help the situation other than by listening?
Okay, that's actually a great question, and it's one that really applies to anyone who's providing services to incarcerated survivors. And it's one that we see come up here at JDI, because we are operating a hotline for incarcerated folks in Michigan. And so that's definitely something that we can say a little bit more about during the Q&A session. Any other responses, Christian?
I think it is hard to say it is fully competent as terminology. Verbal communication are always being improved.
Okay, verbal communication. Yeah, and that's completely point well taken, right? This is work that is dynamic. It's continuing. The work is never done. We keep learning and talking to each other. So that's a great point.
And we could always use more information in education, as well as would like to hear from directly impacted men of color.
Great. Okay. Okay, that's super helpful, and I think we definitely will get some perspectives today from directly impacted men of color. Great. Did you want to add anything else, Christian, or does that kind of give an overview?
That's generally what we have so far.
Okay, great. Okay. And definitely, we'll move on now and sort of jump into the webinar. But feel free as we go along if you want to add anything else in terms of, as Christian said, you can ask questions throughout the webinar, and he can sort of gather them and keep track of them. You can also add in answers to this question around what you think you might need, or places where, as you listen to the webinar, if you feel like, oh, that makes me think about something that we need to work on. And certainly we will be happy to kind of, comment on that, or maybe advise how you can address a particular gap during the Q&A. So let's jump into now, especially knowing that we do have gaps, we do have concerns. Let's start talking about men, race, incarceration, and victimization. Great. So let's talk about who's actually incarcerated in the United States. Although the number of people incarcerated in the U.S. has decreased slightly during the past several years, the U.S. continues to incarcerate more people than any other country in the world. And there are over 2 million adults and 60,000 youth locked up in prisons, jails, and youth facilities around the United States. This number does not reflect the over 5 million people on probation and parole, and this matters because people who are on probation and parole are still under the control of a corrections or law enforcement agency, and may, in some cases, be detained in a community confinement facility that also falls under the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards. Christian, do you need a second to? Great, thank you. Yeah, so there's just that statistic that I was just quoting around the number of folks who are incarcerated in the U.S. So for our discussion today, obviously a critical fact is that more than 90% of all prisoners in the U.S. are male, right? And in the federal system, in federal prisons, roughly 93% of prisoners are male. And who is in juvenile detention settings? Well, 86% of the youth in residential placements are male. So very similar numbers. Um, Okay, and then who are the majority of prisoners? So when you look broadly at who's locked up in the U.S., it's clear that mass incarceration has had a damaging and disproportionate effect on communities of color and low-income communities. In fact, as we said, more than 90% of people who are incarcerated are men. In the juvenile system, it's nearly 90%. More than 60% of people who are incarcerated are people of color. And among all incarcerated men and women, more than half are parents. And 1 in 43 children in the U.S. has a parent who's in prison. And then more than half of all prison and jail inmates have a mental health problem or issue. So you can see how these different aspects of identity around race and gender and concerns around mental health, identity as being, someone's parent, all of these things intersect, and how many of them are represented greatly among our population of incarcerated people. It's also worth noting that half or more of prisoners who have been convicted of a crime are serving time for a nonviolent crime, and that gap is even greater in the federal prison system and in jail. But of course, given the racial disparities in the criminal justice system and the fact that no one deserves to be sexually abused, our focus at JDI is on safety and access to services for all incarcerated survivors, regardless of the nature of the crime that they may have been committed or are charged, convicted of, or are charged with. So, what's the likelihood then that a man of color will end up in prison? Well, for men in general, the likelihood of imprisonment at some point in their life is 1 in 9. That drops to 1 in 17 for white men and jumps up to 1 in 3 for black men and 1 in 6 for Latino men. So black males are 6 times and Hispanic males or Latino males 2.5 times more likely to be imprisoned than white males, found in this study that was done in 2012. So to put this in perspective, in 2011, author and civil rights advocate Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, pointed out that there were more African American men in prison or jail on probation or parole than were enslaved in 1850 before the Civil War began. So let's look more broadly. What about the prevalence of sexual victimization among men in the community? So to start with, we should talk about, the 1 in 6 number, which is basically that at least 1 in 6 men, and this is generally in the community, have experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault at some point in their lives. And some research has found, in fact, that 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused by the time they are 18. Switching to the incarceration context, what's happening behind bars? Well, according to an estimate by the lead researcher at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, roughly 200,000 people are sexually abused in U.S. prisons and jails each year. Now, note that this figure represents the number of people, not the number of incidents, and many of the 200,000 people that are represented here are, in fact, abused more than once. So to put this into perspective, this is approximately the population of Richmond, Virginia, a major U.S. city that's experiencing sexual abuse behind bars every year. And of course, we know that just like sexual abuse in the community, sexual abuse in detention is greatly underreported. So we can surmise that this number is really just, kind of scratching the surface. So over 200,000 people are sexually abused in detention in the U.S. every year, and many of those survivors are also members of groups who are highly subject to oppression and systemic marginalization in the broader society. And we touched on that a little bit a couple slides back when we sort of talked about who is behind bars. So another statistic on the prevalence of sexual abuse in detention, according to a national survey of former state prisoners, 1 in 10 said they had experienced sexual abuse during their most recent incarceration in a state prison, local jail, or community confinement facility. Similarly, 1 in 10 boys in youth facilities report that they have been sexually abused or sexually assaulted in detention. Studies show that nearly equal rates of sexual abuse is committed by staff and by other inmates. So we know that it's not just incarcerated people who commit sexual abuse on other incarcerated people. As often, it's going to be someone who is working in that facility and is actually responsible for the safety and well-being of the people in that facility that commit sexual abuse. Now, this picture shifts a bit in the juvenile context, where in fact, oftentimes you have staff committing sexual assault more often. And as we see here, 82% of sexual assaults of males in youth detention settings are committed by staff. And concerningly, quite often that staff sexual abuse is committed by women staff working in the facility. I believe that number is probably about 90% of the time where you have a male youth in a detention facility that's reporting sexual abuse by staff. So I've focused quite a lot on race and what the criminal justice system looks like for men and boys of color, but we know that identity is not that simple and that factors such as those listed here can make an incarcerated person even more vulnerable to sexual abuse and even more marginalized and less likely to get the help that they need. We know that inmates who are LGBT, those who are survivors of prior abuse, and those who have mental illness are the most vulnerable to sexual abuse in in detention, and that statistics back that up. Those who have disabilities or who are relatively young in comparison to the facility population or relatively small in stature are also at elevated risk. So let's keep in mind the role that these different aspects of a person's profile play, and in particular, the ways in which intersectionality is at work here, and all of the factors that might make one vulnerable to abuse or more likely to be overlooked and marginalized once something has happened. And that can make someone all the more vulnerable to retaliation and to further abuse. And then now, in terms of hearing from, kind of hearing from the voices of people with lived experience, this is Martine. He's a former prisoner talking about how he feels people see him. And given that we're talking about men of color, it's important to just kind of have this lens, right, as we have this discussion. So he says, I know that a lot of advocates and people doing the work also are filled with news media and these lockup shows and stories about what we do in prison. And I think the more people watch those things, the less human I become. When Martine says the less human I become, I think that what he's getting at is that people like him, currently or formerly incarcerated men, typically are underserved and overlooked in a lot of ways, largely because they're not seen as victims or even potential victims. And this line from Martine is part of what inspired us at JDI to create a training module that you can find on our website called No Bad Victims, in which we tried to dismantle the idea that incarcerated victims are somehow less worthy of support than other victims. As advocates, working with incarcerated victims can feel like an entirely new role, and for some, it can feel like a deviation from your core mission. But the reality is that there are no bad victims, and incarcerated victims may, in fact, be the ones who need you the most. And that brings us to the question of, would you help them and are you ready to help them? Questions that we've already been, sort of talking about today, particularly in terms of whether your program and you as an advocate are ready to provide the needed assistance. These images are from a campaign JDI launched over 10 years ago that looked at helping to bridge the gap between victims in the community and victims in detention and humanizing prisoners. So if you look at the sort of first image, you have a Latino man, and then the first picture, it says, would you joke around about this man being raped? And then in the latter image, it says, how about now, right, in prison garb? Would you still make a joke? Or would you actually be more likely? Because what we see, of course, is that we're still quite comfortable making jokes on late night TV and in other sort of venues within popular culture about sexual abuse in detention. And then in the lower picture, you have an African American man, and it says, if you could help stop this man from getting AIDS, would you, when he's in street garb? And then how about now, when he's in his prison garb? So keep that in mind as we go through the conversation today. So let's dig a bit more deeply into understanding and contextualizing trauma among incarcerated men of color. The image that you see here is of Troy Isaac. Troy is a formerly incarcerated man. He was just 12 years old when he was sexually assaulted by teenage boys at a youth detention facility. And then later on in California state prisons, he suffered continuing sexual abuse and harassment. He's now a member of JDI's Survivor Council, and he's someone who advocates against sexual abuse in detention and is someone who's a leading voice on these issues in his own right. Great. So, and now I want to invite very happily Richard Smith, who's an academic, activist, and healer with nearly 2 decades of experience developing and implementing community-based programs for disadvantaged populations. Smith is currently the National Director of Healing Works, which is a learning collaborative that addresses the healing needs of male survivors of violence in the community by delivering tools, information, and technical support to organizations that serve them. He's also currently one of the technical assistance leaders for the U.S. Department of Justice's National Resource Center on Reaching Underserved Victims. He's also a doctoral candidate, and his research focus is male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Welcome, Richard, and thank you so much for being part of this webinar.
Hello. Thank you, Christian and Cynthia, so much for giving me this opportunity to be here and to share a little bit about the work that I'm doing and mostly be a part of the conversation to highlight the importance of this issue and the impact that sexual assault, incarceration, and mass incarceration has had on the Black community, and more specifically on boys and men of color.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know you haven't been feeling well, so we're even more appreciative of your involvement in the webinar. So to start, can you tell us a little bit about your work at Healing Works and its relevance to the issues that we're talking about today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll actually start by saying more. So Healing Works, we were formerly known as Healing Works. We're currently known as United for Healing Equity, and I'll share a little bit about that transition and why that transition is so important. But United for Healing Equity, or Healing, formerly known as Healing Works, is a project that's out of Common Justice. And what we do at Common Justice is we develop and advance solutions to violence that transforms the lives of the people who've been harmed, and foster racial equity without relying on the criminal justice system and incarceration. And in Brooklyn and in the Bronx, we operate the first alternatives to incarceration program and victim services program in the country that operates in the adult courts. And then what we do on a national level, more so through Healing Works and our communication strategy, is we leverage the lessons that we learn from our direct service work through our Alternatives to Incarceration program, where we serve those who've been charged with felonies in an adult court, ages 16 to 24, through our Alternative Incarceration program that's rooted in restorative justice principles. We serve them and we learn from those lessons and share those lessons nationally throughout the country. And so just really quickly about United for Healing Equity, or what was formerly known as Healing Works. What we learned after 10 years or so of the work that we were doing through our Alternatives to Incarceration program, where we were providing services to predominantly, overwhelmingly, boys and men of color who had been charged with violent crimes, we learned that they who were responsible for causing harm had also previously experienced harm. And essentially, it was just that adage, right, that we currently say a lot, is that hurt people hurt people. But then we started to realize that, okay, if hurt people, healed people can start that healing process as well, right? And so who are the people who are out in the country and in the communities where we know that there's more violence prevalent, serving boys and men of color and providing them with healing spaces and supporting their healing process. And through that emerged a listening tour where we gathered a ton of information and relied heavily on experts in the field and folks in the field who've been doing that work for many years, and came up with our learning community called Healing Works. And Healing Works' focus was to provide resources and an opportunity for folks who are doing that work to be connected and to learn from the best practices and emerging practices in the work that other folks were doing throughout the country. But since we determined that boys and men of color do not heal in isolation, and I'm glad that you made that point earlier, Cynthia, about how complex identities are and intersectionality. And what we also started to hear is that folks were saying, you know, what about trans men of color, right? What about LGBT folks of color? And so we realized that if we were really going to be committed to promoting healing equity throughout the country, we needed to broaden our perspective and our approach to consider how we can increase the capacity of people of color and the power of people of color to get the resources that they need to heal, and not exclusively focus on boys and men of color, but it be inclusive of all of the members of the communities of color, LGBTQIA, women of color, gender nonconforming, and trans folks of color as well in the process.
Wow, that is really powerful. And I should have mentioned that you're based in New York City, but certainly, as you've said, the models that you're creating are nationally replicable. And one of the things that I find so exciting about your work is that it's bringing forth a very simple concept, but one that I think that we in the sort of service provision and advocacy, communities don't always remember and maybe need to, to be a little bit more cognizant of, is that when you're thinking about people who are in detention, boys and men in detention, and in particular for the purposes of this conversation, you're not just talking about folks who have perpetrated some sort of harm or committed some sort of crime or been charged with some sort of crime. There are reasons lying behind that, often, in fact, or at least in part, right, are the trauma that they have experienced, the harm that they have experienced, and that hurt people do, in fact, hurt people. So I think that that is a really important piece. And one of the things that I've heard you talk about, and the reason why boys and men of color, particularly those in the criminal justice system, are often so acutely underserved, is that we haven't done enough work to recognize them as potential victims. The dialogue that has taken place in society so often sort of depicts them immediately as aggressive, angry, dangerous, with little sort of recognition of the direct linkages between victimization, trauma, and sort of the lack of services that they've typically received or really had meaningful access to in the community, acknowledgement of those experiences, and then, of course, that subsequent criminal justice involvement. The problems don't arrive at the corrections facility. There's usually a long story, long before the arrest, long before the arraignment, of how did this person end up in these circumstances and why. So, and in many cases, the acts, that have kind of led them to the criminal justice system are trauma responses, at least to some degree. So I think that that's a critical part of the conversation. And I want to just lift up the example of Troy, who we saw a picture of a couple slides back, because he has talked about how, as a result of the sexual abuse he experienced in juvenile detention, he experienced what he called a downfall, which led to further difficulties, including being sentenced to adult prison. And then in adult prison, he experienced further sexual abuse and further marginalization because his abuse was not recognized. He did not receive the services that he needed, and he was not, in fact, recognized as a survivor until much later, after he came out of detention. So to continue, Richard, go for it if you had something that you wanted to add, or otherwise I'm just going to keep peppering you with questions.
You can. And I'm grateful for the analysis that you just offered, right, of the situation, to emphasize like the complexities of the experience of trauma, right? It's not one single incident. It's usually, it's multiple incidents and experiences of trauma. And then the other thing that folks who are currently incarcerated, previously incarcerated, have dealt with or have not been dealt with or addressed for those folks. And you're exactly right, that their behavior is symptomatic of the unaddressed trauma. The other thing that I also, in the work that we do, because one of the main things that we focus on is supporting organizations throughout the country who want to enhance their services for boys and men of color who've been impacted by trauma and violence, right, is to help them contextualize the single incidents of traumatization by considering the impact of racial trauma, structural violence, and all of these other more systemic, larger incidents and experiences or historical experiences of traumatization that people of color bring to the table and bring to their current circumstances, that they may not even be conscious of it as well, but influences their perception of the folks who's reaching out to them to try to serve them. It influences their perception of the systems that you may represent, that even though those systems are designed for the purpose of supporting, if we consider the historical narrative of racism in this country and how systems have not always functioned in the favor of people of color, and in many instances have harmed people of color, there's this cultural distrust that exists, right? And so it's important for us to be able to contextualize this incident of a traumatization with those things in mind when we think about the way that we serve boys and men of color, because if we don't, there's a potential for us to end up blaming them for not responding well to our outreach or our attempts to provide the services that we know that they need to heal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in your experience then, what are some of the prevalent experiences of violence that you are seeing boys and men of color bring with them into the detention setting? What is that trauma looking like, or where does it come from?
So the trauma is, there's a lot of poly-victimization, right? So there's trauma that stems from community violence, right? Whether it's really physical assault. There's also trauma that's vicarious, that witnessing people that you know and you love and you care about being hurt, that's extremely prevalent. There's trauma that takes place in the home in the form of domestic violence and child sexual abuse. And the sad part about it is that oftentimes when folks come, when young men of color present, they present being impacted by traumatization that took place in the home, in the community, and now in the juvenile detention center, and now in the prison that they're incarcerated in. But the sad part about it is that no one has really ever taken the time to really ask them what happened to you, right? And we know that, right? We know that that's the major shift to trauma-informed care from this more punitive approach that we've typically taken. Is not saying something is wrong with them, but like what happened to you that caused you to act in this way that hurts yourself and hurts other people. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and so then that's really the linkage between those experiences of trauma and the sort of high rates of criminal justice involvement, is that unacknowledged levels of violence, traumatization, lack of services, et cetera. So I wanted to kind of come in a little bit more personally, if it's okay with you. I know that these issues are really close to your heart, and I wanted to ask you if you wouldn't mind saying a little more about your own experiences and what brought you to this work.
Yeah. So the way that I became interested in researching childhood sexual abuse was specifically focusing on boys and men of color was through during the time that I was incarcerated, because I'm also formerly incarcerated. I was in a maximum security facility, and I was facilitating a support group. At this point, I started to do some work on myself. I was able to get some mental health support because I knew that there was something wrong, and I knew that I did not want to continue to go down this path of going in and out of the revolving door of jails and prison my entire life. So something clicked for me. And then I started to share what I was learning from my journey of trying to heal with other men who were incarcerated. And it was this one particular night that I was providing this, facilitating this group with about 40 plus guys in this maximum security facility. And there was a Latino gentleman who spoke up and started to talk about how whenever he called home collect, his daughter would tell him that she was being sexually abused, and her boyfriend, her mother's boyfriend, was touching her. And in this room, you could hear a pin drop, because you can imagine how all of these men, many of these men being fathers, felt, realizing that they were powerless if anything were to happen to their own children. And out of this group, after a while, this big guy, his street name was Truck, he got up and he started to talk about his experiences of being a victim of sexual abuse. And he went on, and he was like almost in a zone and phased out. And people were just like, so attentive and like just on edge listening to this guy talk about it. And he stated how he never told anyone about this experience. And then he said, the only time that I ever felt normal was when I was violent. And that's when it hit me. And that's when it really hit home for me to understand the impact of my experiences of child sexual abuse and how that contributed to many of the decisions that I had made growing up that led me on that path to incarceration. And what I then started to do is like wanted to learn more about how sexual assault impacts men. And I realized that, that is a typical response of child sexual abuse as a result of, concepts of masculinity that we internalize very early on, that, we're not susceptible, we shouldn't be susceptible to violence, we shouldn't be vulnerable, or we shouldn't allow anyone to take advantage of us. And these are messages that we've internalized even early on. But the way that we respond is we develop this like exaggerated sense of masculinity, and we become excessively aggressive in order to try to counter those feelings and those thoughts about us being, effeminate or homosexual or weaker or less than. And so from that experience, I realized that, I was not alone, and that so many other men who were incarcerated, who weren't incarcerated, and boys had also experienced it. And then, many years later, when I was doing my, doctoral research and just like my professional experience, I started to see how prevalent it was among boys and men of color.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you, first of all, for sharing all of that. It's really powerful, both in terms of the group that you were leading and the sort of disclosure and disclosures that came from some of the men in the group, but also for sharing about your personal story. And I wanted to ask if you received any services while you were in detention. What was your experience with whether or not you could get, help? You talked about how you knew that there was something that you wanted to address within yourself. And you were obviously helping others through leading these groups, but were you able to find some of the support that you needed?
Yeah, so, just recently, a friend of mine who's doing a lot of work around, ending solitary confinement in prisons, posted something on Facebook that kind of triggered me. And, I really never thought about solitary confinement as it relates to my personal experiences with it until watching this video. And it was a young boy, African-American boy, man, he was probably about 19, and he talked about his incarceration at the age of 16 and how when he was incarcerated, he ended up going to the hole or to solitary confinement at 16 years old and spending like 9 months in solitary confinement to the point where people forgot about him. And it was really triggering for me because part of the reason why I never really acknowledged my experience with solitary confinement is because during my incarceration, I had met people who had spent 1, 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years in solitary confinement. So for me to think about my experiences with a few months, it was like, it wasn't that serious. But the reason why I first experienced solitary confinement at the age of 16 is because when I was incarcerated, the guard went to search me, and he touched me while I was naked, as that process normally is, in a way that triggered me, and I kind of just lost it. And it was at the age of 16 that, I didn't know. I couldn't articulate and express what I was experiencing, and nor did I want it to, right? Because I needed to stay face as a boy. I couldn't talk about my experiences of sexual abuse, right? But I did react, and I reacted. And as a result of that, I was sent, and I spent the entire time that I was incarcerated at the age of 16 in an adult jail on a wing separated from the rest of the jail in solitary confinement. And so early on, I did not get any support from the institution when it comes to addressing the needs of childhood sexual abuse or sexual assault inside. It wasn't until, as an adult when I reoffended, committed another crime and went back to jail, in prison this time, that I had hit rock bottom. I got to a place where I was just like totally over the pain that I experienced growing up, the pain that I inflicted on myself, and I no longer wanted to live, and I attempted suicide. And that's one of the ways you get the institution's attention. And after that suicide attempt, a lot of therapists, it was like mandatory for me to go and talk to a therapist. And I was just so fortunate to be able to meet a therapist, and I'll call him Jim, who was not like any of the people in the institution, and he actually cared. And he took the time to truly support me and try to talk to me and understand where I was coming from and where this anger was coming from. And it was with him that I felt safe enough to talk about my experience of child sexual abuse. And it was him who helped to start that process of healing for me. And then the sad part about it is that, a year later, Jim was actually kind of let go from the jail. And my thought was that because he cared and he wanted to help.
Wow. Well, thank you, Richard, for sharing all that. I mean, there's, quite a lot of important messages, I think, in your story. So what I want to do is move on, but we're definitely going to come back to you during the Q&A and get some of your advice and what you think victim advocates need to know when they're working with male survivors who are incarcerated. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about considerations for victim services provisions. And really look at what advocates can do to strengthen their capacity to provide services for incarcerated male survivors. And before we talk with Mona Brown, who is the advocate who's joining us today, I wanted to just hear again from a directly impacted person, and that is Rodney Roussel. Here you have a picture of Rodney, and he shares a little bit about his experience. Rodney is a survivor of sexual abuse in detention, and now he's also an advocate for prisoners' rights. He's a formerly incarcerated person. He says, I had been in a crowded holding cell for just a few hours when two guys approached me. One sexually assaulted me while the other held me down. Staff were nowhere to be seen. I looked around at all the other guys in that cell, trying to say with my eyes that I needed help, but all I saw were people turning their backs on me or looking away. He goes on to say, a few days later, I was raped by a different man. This time, the rapist sold me to another inmate who forced me to have sex whenever he wanted, either with him or anyone else he chose. This was, in a word, enslavement. My body no longer belonged to me, but to someone else, to my husband, quote unquote, a rapist who totally controlled my life with the constant threat of violence. So Rodney's story is an example of what we call protective pairing. Rodney's abuser controls him with the constant threat of violence. Staff knew about this abusive relationship, but they did not say anything because protective pairings are seen as an acceptable part of prison culture. The relationship with his abuser was so similar to domestic violence because, like many survivors, he felt entrapped by the constant fear and danger of even more violence, and he couldn't get away. But I think what we've heard so far is we've really, gotten to think about sexual abuse that occurs within facilities, and then also sexual abuse that happens to people in the community, and then the way that both of those different types of experiences are traumatic and linked to further harm and to involvement beyond that in the criminal justice system. So let's go ahead and welcome Mona Brown from the Women's Center High Desert in Ridgecrest, California, in Kern County, in an area that is surrounded by 4 mountain ranges. Welcome, Mona.
Thank you. Can you hear me good?
Absolutely, yeah. So you serve as Women's Center's High Desert PREA counselor and group facilitator. And you've got years of experience now providing counseling both individually and in groups for male survivors in California prisons. So I'm really excited that you're here. So tell
Thank
us
you.
a little bit about the facilities that you're working in and how your groups operate.
Sure. I work in two different CDCR facilities. One houses lifers that have reviews in front of the boards and in front of committees, depending on their behavior and how much time they spent. And the other facility, all of the men have actual release dates. And as far as the group goes, and just so you know, we made a few changes from the current flyer that you're now seeing. My clients usually range from the ages of 35 to 45. There's a small percentage of those 25 and younger that I usually get for just one-on-one. The majority of the clients are actually Black and Latino, and I have 12 to 15 men in each group. The group sessions run from 7 weeks, usually from 7 weeks, depending on if I get shut down for security issues, riots, things like that. But they always give me back the weeks that I lost. And throughout the duration, I attained 3 to 10 men asking for one-on-one sessions out of those groups.
Okay. And Mona, you do sound a little bit far away now that I'm hearing you talk. If you're able to be a little bit closer to the phone, or I'm not quite sure what it might be.
Is this better?
That's better. Yeah, that's a lot better.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Sure.
Great. So now, what do you do in terms of preserving confidentiality so that when you're conducting a group, not everyone knows the identities of the men who are in the group?
Well, first, my group is shielded under the name Hope for Healing. And as you can see from the flyer, we have to be very careful in how we worded it and the verbiage. Not only so they'll feel safe signing up, but also we don't want to give the impression that they're going to be inundated with conversation on sexual violence. And all the men are given ducats, and these are hall passes in order for them to be able to walk through the corridors. And the only people that really know about the ducats are my PCM and the community resource manager who sets up the time and the location for the group. Very few officers know what my group is about, except for those that are guarding my area. And even with those officers, I tell them it's very important to never call me a PREA counselor. The men are also given guidelines of confidentiality once they decide to stay in the group. And I have not received any backlash or complaints of the men reporting that they've had issues from other inmates or staff because they've taken the group. And I do want to add that very few gang members will join the group, whether it being their personal politics, the crimes they've committed, or the trauma that they're ashamed of in being initiated. But very seldom do I have any gang members.
Great. And how do you make your group accessible? And what I mean is that a lot of men will not be comfortable joining a group with the word rape in it, or for example, if the group is run by an organization with the word women in it. How did you overcome those challenges?
Yeah, and the name of the organization really was a hindrance, and actually PREA in my title was a hindrance. So I completely eliminated PREA from any information or documentation that I hand out to my clients. And by the way, I'm also taking courses to be certified as a substance abuse counselor, because as we know, that is a big part of trauma for anyone who has gone through something like that. And as you see from the flyer, I use domestic violence and child abuse in my lesson plan, even stating if they want to help others to overcome that trauma. There's only been a few times that anyone claims they were asking for questions for someone else, but honestly, it's a support group. I don't run it like a class, so I don't want them to feel centered out or pressured to answer questions. And I want them to feel inclusive and secure in the group.
That's great. So before we continue, I wanted to just mention that while Mona and I are talking, you'll see some images of incarcerated male survivors of color who have written to JDI to seek resources and support via mail. So each of them have provided their photo and have given us permission to use their name and picture. Two of these men are JDI Survivor Council members, and that's noted in their photo caption, such as it is with this first survivor, Dwight Hines. So Mona, back to our conversation, how was it in the beginning getting your program started?
It was very difficult. We had meetings on top of meetings for months. In one of the facilities, there was a hesitation from staff, and in the other facility, there were inmates that simply refused to discuss sexual assault. But I learned, depending on the political climate of the facility, there lies my largest battles every time. Since the Prison Elimination Act is now law, staff came on board, and that was pretty easy. However, the facility with the inmates that refused to talk about sexual assault, we decided to meet with the shot callers, i.e. MAC men or trustees by staff. And with them, they were adamant about discussing sexual assault because there is a stigma of pedophilia or a weakness associated with sexual assault. So with my supervisor, Karen, Liliana, previously from Calcasa, and Jessica, and Gwen, we all came up with an alternative method. We told the MAC men we would add to the group agenda domestic violence, child abuse, and remove sexual from our verbiage to simply just say assault. And this seemed to make my services more acceptable. And one of the guys was even chose to co-facilitate in my group. And once we created the flyers, the MAC men began telling other inmates about the group, and there it seemed to really take off from there.
Great. And I just want to clarify something. When you use the word shot caller, some folks may think that you're talking about like a sort of a violent gang member, someone who has power in the facility because of sort of, activities and things that they're involved in that they shouldn't be. But what you're talking about is more like trustees, like people who have a certain level of prominence or trust in the facility. And so are people that other incarcerated men might go to and talk to or take example from, or not because of something untoward or because they're forcing people to do something. Am I right about that?
Yeah, exactly. The staff actually chooses them.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so they have responsibilities, like they might be the people that when you arrive at the prison and you see some inmates outside the facility doing certain, roles, cleaning up, gardening, et cetera, they tend to have a little bit more liberty and sort of get some of those jobs that might involve a bit more responsibility or a bit more freedom, so to speak, than some of the other types of responsibilities in the facility. So I want to turn... Yeah, so I want to turn now to find out a little bit more, and this is kind of getting back a little bit more to our subject matter. As you said, most of the men who are in your groups are Latino or Black, and I want to hear a little bit more about what do they talk about in the group and in the individual sessions that you conduct. What sort of, do you get lots of disclosures about sexual abuse? What kind of happens?
Yeah, absolutely. I get quite a few disclosures, but it takes time. Most of the men go back from when they were abused as children, which 95%, I might say, is that. That is the case. And there was some type of or form of molestation. Some talk about abuse in their intimate relationships and how it led to their crimes. And in the facility, I counsel men going in front of the board, or the ones that are going in front of the board. They focus on thinking inward, taking out the victim mentality and how their crime affected individuals and the community as a whole, which always leads back to what their trauma was in the beginning where it started with their crime. And some will come for one-on-one because they've tried everything the prison system has offered, and they're just hoping that I'll shed some light on their confusion of trauma where no one else had even talked about it or mentioned it.
hmm And I should say, when you use the word board, you mean the parole board, right? Because some of these men
Yes,
are up for parole.
yes,
Great.
there's a
So what
committee
are,
for the board.
yeah,
Mhm.
okay. And then what are some of the barriers that you see to doing this work successfully? What is it that makes it challenging in some cases?
Well, incest and sexual assault has been a taboo subject in many Black and Latino cultures. Even just about 4 or 5 years ago, that's not something that a lot of men would admit happened to them, much less get counseling for it. And I'll have men admit to being molested but refuse to tell me if it was a family member. There's also the fear that if they open up, will I, as their counselor, talk to mental health about putting them on meds? And most of the men that have not been diagnosed with a mental disorder, they do not want to take any meds. So sadly, many don't even know what sexual abuse or molestation looks like. I have to continue with consistent dialogue to finally get them to open up about their victimization.
hmm Yeah, and along those lines, something that we've seen at JDI on our hotline is that with Black and Latino men in particular who call the hotline, including because of their religious beliefs or expectations that are upon them because of their religious upbringings, they may be reticent to talk about sexual abuse with anyone, or they don't want to talk with their friends about it, or they might not want to talk with another man about it, including an advocate who is a man. And then they may even get into things like conflating sexual abuse that was perpetrated by a man. They may talk about it in homophobic ways, even though that has nothing to do with being gay or anything like that. And so there are some of those pieces that I'm sure you're then kind of having to help them unpack. And they may even want to talk, at least, our experience at JDI, they may even ask to talk to an advocate who's of the same race or religion that they are. So those are just some examples that we see. Yeah.
Yeah, a part of my group guidelines, when I even begin group, I hand out guidelines. I ask them to respect everyone's opinions and their belief systems. We seldom go into the topic of religion, but I do tell them in the beginning, we all have to talk like natural men so everyone can understand what we're discussing.
Absolutely. So have you had any concerns around your own safety as you've been doing this work, going in and out of these facilities?
No, not really. Not since I've been working with CDCR. I did on the county level when I worked in Bakersfield at Laredo, but I do know from the experience, I'm always on alert what's around me, what's going on. I'm very careful. I always let my bosses know where I am in each facility, and I definitely let the officers know if I have to leave or take a break and what room I'm stationed in. So I'm very careful with that.
Yeah, and one thing that I think shows how successful you've been is you've done 6 sessions of your group now, and you've got a huge waiting list, right? A couple hundred men are waiting to get these services.
Yes, I have 230 waiting right now.
Wow, that's really powerful. And so what about the racial dynamics and the politics of the facility? You referred to that earlier. Is that important?
Oh, most definitely. Depending where they are transferred from or where they originally were in their neighborhood. Say, for instance, if they're coming from the South, most of the men are Black. And I have quite a few clients that came to the U.S. illegally that will be deported back to Mexico and different places. But regardless, I don't care where my clients originated from or their culture. I'm going to do everything I can to help them in healing. And I let them know that up front because some of them do hesitate to tell me what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say as just a couple of closing thoughts or advice to some of the programs that are listening in today? How can a program go about better preparing itself to provide high quality trauma-informed services to incarcerated men of color?
Well, I think you hit it on the nail with your questionnaire in the beginning. Um, Honestly, hire people of color. That is very important. This work is very intense. If you have biases, address them before you go into the facility. Learn the politics of each facility because it varies depending on the location. Never make judgment calls and let your clients know that's not who you are. And it's always okay not to be perfect. Burning out happens to a lot of people, but always be ready for something you've never heard and open for something you need to change. And I do want to mention that I am currently working on a lowering recidivism program in my area, and hopefully it'll spread out in different areas. But I think all organizations should consider how to lower recidivism, no matter what your work is doing in the prison.
Oh, that's a really amazing advice, because really what you're talking about there is again trying to have a larger impact and an impact that really sort of acknowledges the connections between the prior trauma that a lot of incarcerated folks have experienced and the criminal justice system, and trying to break down some of those linkages so that you don't have that swinging door of so many folks recidivating and coming back in and serving more time because they haven't actually gotten the help that they need around dealing with some of these issues. And of course, there's all kinds of other layers we can talk about in terms of the sort of consequences of having been incarcerated and how hard it is to get a job and housing and all of that. But certainly, if a person has not had any opportunity to heal and deal with past trauma, it becomes very difficult to move on. So thank you, Mona, for that so far. We'll definitely come back to you during the Q&A. But before we move into the Q&A, I wanted to kind of wrap up the discussion by considering how an incarcerated survivor, looking at this question of how an incarcerated survivor decides whether to report abuse and what considerations might be foremost. Obviously, that is something that advocates often talk with their clients about, is kind of that question of what it might look like to make a report, what they might expect if they do make a report, safety planning, and sort of all of the things that go into that. So in the incarcerated context, why don't survivors tell? Why don't, what is it that is sort of on people's minds? So here we have some examples. And according to a Bureau of Justice Statistics study, many incarcerated survivors did not want anyone to know about the assault or assaults due to feelings of embarrassment or shame. So survivors, as you can see here, they may not speak out because they fear that their report will not be kept confidential. They have little trust in staff to properly handle and investigate the situation. They do not know even how to make a report, what the channels are. They don't recognize what has happened to them as meeting the definition of abuse, or they fear being blamed for the abuse. And while this can happen to any incarcerated survivor, this can be particularly common for inmates who are the most vulnerable, including LGBT inmates or inmates who are seen as less able to defend themselves. Great. And then I just wanted to wrap up with a few things that we hear at JDI. And so wanting to just give voice to what many incarcerated survivors hear when they do make a disclosure or make a report within the facility. At JDI, we receive about 2,000 letters and over 50 calls a month from survivors of sexual abuse. That's not including our hotline. That's just sort of other calls and communications that we receive. And the quotes that you see on the slide are all real life responses that survivors have received and that they've told us about. These are not things that JDI has made up. So just as some examples, we've heard from a victimized inmate whose own father said, "How could you let yourself get raped by a guard? What kind of man are you?" A nurse told one survivor, "Your medical kite said that you were coming down for chest pain. So you're basically telling me that you lied about a life-threatening medical condition. I'm going to need to speak to an officer about this." An investigator who said, "We reviewed the videotape from that night and didn't see an officer raping you. We know you're lying. If you don't retract your statement, we'll charge you with making a false report." A survivor's cellmate who told him, "Are you for real? I can't hang out with no punk. Don't say nothing to me again about that, bro." So these are just, examples of some of the things that folks might be thinking about, expecting, fearing when they're having that conversation with you and thinking about, what their next step might be and whether or not they are ready to disclose to someone besides the counselor that they are hopefully having a confidential conversation with. So with that, I want to open it up for Q&A. We have about 15 minutes left, and what you'll see here on our Q&A slide is a collage of survivors. These are all incarcerated or formerly incarcerated survivors who have all reached out to Just Detention International at some point, and just wanted to kind of lift up, their voices as we have this conversation. So, Christian, do we have any questions or comments that anyone has written in during the presentation?
Yeah, so this is a question for Richard. Can you talk about the work Common Justice does and where you're based?
Hello. Yeah, so
Hi.
as I was saying earlier, the work that we do is really our primary focus on the direct service end is our Alternatives to Incarceration program that works with young people 16 to 24 who've been charged with violent crimes, and they go through a very comprehensive program with our staff that includes giving them a background about culture, the history of trauma, the racial trauma, historical trauma, but it's mostly rooted in restorative principles and practices. So before anyone can go through our program, before we accept anyone into the program, we go through this process. Our outreach people go through this process of making sure that the person who has caused the harm, the person who has been harmed, the district attorney, as well as the defense attorney, are all in agreement that coming to Common Justice for our Alternatives to Incarceration program is the right path. And once they do that, they go through this comprehensive programming of 15 months that I could share more about it. That's not directly the work that I do. Really, the work that I do is talking about the lessons that we've learned and implementing the lessons that we learned and the information that we've gathered from the field, and then the information that we know is relevant to supporting the healing process of boys and men of color, and now expanding to a more equitable lens that's inclusive of folks in color in general. We utilize that information to support organizations, whether it's through technical assistance of like developing a strategic plan or program design to help enhance their services for boys and men of color, or providing a training about historical trauma, racial trauma, and the impact of trauma on boys and men of color and how it exacerbates the experience of the interpersonal violence that they may encounter. And then more recently, we've started to delve into the area of doing work to heal the healers, and just realizing that many of the folks who are doing this work on the ground are wounded healers who come to this work with their own lived experiences as survivors, as formerly incarcerated people who've been impacted by violence, and how important it is for us to make sure that we're deliberate and helping them to be deliberate in making sure that they can continuously support the healing process of the folks who are doing the work, because we're seeing that throughout the country, especially with programs like credible messenger programs, there's a tremendous amount of burnout, and burnout for folks who experience harm, who have this lived experiences, is not always as simple as someone just leaving a job, but sometimes it can harm the work, and it can show up in a way in the work that can compromise our efforts.
Thank you, Richard. So this next question is from Mona. I'm curious if Mona has encountered men who have disclosed the types of violence and abuse that come from protective pairing type.
I'm sorry.
Excuse me, protective pairing type relationships like the one Cynthia described regarding Rodney. And if so, how does she support those survivors?
I'm sorry, you cut off. Would you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. So they're asking if you've encountered men who have disclosed the types of violence and abuse that come from protective pairing type relationships like the one Cynthia described earlier regarding Rodney, and if so, how do you support those survivors?
Well, because it is a very difficult topic, and some won't outright tell me where the abuse is coming from, I always ask them about their childhood. I always ask them about their relationships currently. Oh, I'm getting a lot of echoing. But I think in order to let them know that I am there to help them is simply giving them tools in coping with having bad dreams or having flashbacks or the triggers, and letting them know that I'm always available for them to call me. They do have a hotline in all of the facilities that I work in, and so I'm always available for them to contact me.
Thanks, Mona. And
right. And if I could I add to that, Christian? Because
sure.
I think this goes to there was something that one of the advocates or someone participating raised towards the beginning of the webinar around listening to your clients, to the incarcerated people that you're working with, and the fact, though, I think what they were getting at was that sometimes it feels like that's not enough, or it can feel like, oh, I want to do more. So in the case of someone who's in a protective pairing relationship, and I don't provide advocacy services myself, but from my, sort of what I've heard in terms of the work that we're doing, I think that first of all, the fact of listening and sort of providing a space where that person can talk about what is happening to them is really important. I think really countering the messages that they may be receiving that this is something that's their fault is really important and really powerful, because those messages may be coming both from the person that they're in that protective pairing situation with, as well as from the facility itself, that often overlooks any sort of involvement between inmates that can be written off as consensual or lovers, some sort of, lovers quarrel or something like that, without really investigating what's going on. And then I think the other piece that you can do, though, is around sort of safety planning, especially if it's something where that person feels like, okay, this is what I'm going to do for now, or this is the best situation for me to be in now with this individual, so that I'm not subject to harm by more individuals. But still, hopefully within that, there may be some ability to negotiate some of the terms under which things happen, whether that's negotiating safer sex or that's negotiating more sort of ability to have access to services, or, kind of talking through with that person, what does your situation look like, and where is there room for more safety and sort of a greater sense of well-being for you in this, if that makes sense.
I want to also add that I haven't had a lot of the LGBTQ population come to me, and in the facilities that I work at, they are transferred out. But for those that I have had on the county level, I have advocated that they be moved whenever they felt they were in danger.
Yeah, and that's important too as well, right? So if that person is saying, I want to get out of this situation, I want to be in a safer situation, some of the systems advocacy that you may end up engaging in as an advocate is around looking at what safer alternatives there may be. Is it, potentially being transferred to another facility, being placed in a different housing arrangement, having that person who is sexually abusing them, making that report and going, not for you to make that report, but I mean, sort of helping that survivor to make that report, so that then that case can be investigated, and hopefully that perpetrator can be put into a different, taken away, and that survivor can be safe, and that perpetrator can be somewhere where they cannot harm others. So those are all considerations as well.
Great, thank you. And there's a two-parter for Mona as well. Is there a specific curriculum you use for the support group? And also, I know that you said it was a long process to start, but did you start with the commissioners or wardens, senators, or representatives?
Oh, that would have been nice if I could have started with the senators. But my curriculum is not what everyone thinks it is, and I would be happy to leave my email address if you would like to know what it looks like. I can send you a copy of it. But the meetings that we had that were constant were with the wardens, ISU, which are the investigators that work in the prison, the associative wardens, and also medical and mental health. So, yeah, it would have been nice to be able to talk to senators, but because everything felt like it was taking so intensely long, I guess that would have took even longer just to go that far, or to the top, I guess you could say.
Thanks.
Are there other
Yeah, so how do you navigate red tape or unwillingness from institutions to allow intervention from outside advocacy agencies? It's been a huge barrier for someone in upstate New York.
Bill Comrade.
So if I can I just comment on that first, and then Mona, if you want to jump in. So I think, a couple things. One is to kind of remember that, first of all, the PREA standards have certain requirements, right? So if a corrections facility is putting sort of pushback against your efforts to provide services and is just treating this as like, oh, we don't need your services, we don't need your help, the first piece is that there are certain things that they need to do, and they are required to attempt to enter into a relationship, an agreement with local victim services providers to provide access to folks incarcerated in their facility via phone and or mail, as well as hospital accompaniment when folks are going out for a forensic exam. If you're getting pushback, especially if you're in New York State, I would highly recommend that you talk to your state coalition. And Eric Bjorkman in particular at the State Coalition. You can also reach out directly to us because we do talk quite a lot with the folks in New York, and we may be able to help you. So when we get to the next slide or two that kind of shows information for follow-up or how to get more help, go ahead and reach out to us directly. Other advice, you might want to talk directly to the PREA compliance manager at the facility, or the PREA compliance, PREA coordinator for the whole agency, and agencies are supposed to provide that information, that contact information on their websites. So those are just some initial ideas.
Yeah. And I was going to say,
maybe we have, go ahead, Mona, sorry.
It is important to build relationships within the facilities. I mean, None of them are going to have the same political atmosphere, but once you start understanding what is happening, who you're actually working with as far as the officers and the warden, it'll be easier. Let them know that you're there to make their job easier. You're not an adversary. You're there to help them. You want them to also feel safe that you're speaking to inmates about growth and not about rebellion. Because a lot of times I think that's where their heads go. Are they going to give them information to make them rebel? So make them feel comfortable about your services.
That's great. So we're going to need to wrap up. What I would recommend is that if anyone has further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I do want to mention that next week on April 17th is the second webinar in this series, and it's going to focus on incarcerated LGBTI survivors. There's the link to register for that webinar if you haven't already. And then on the next slide, you'll see where we have here, you can email us at advocate@justdetention.org. And any additional questions that you have, or if you need some technical assistance, go ahead and contact us that way. Or if you want to reach out to Mona or Richard directly, if you go ahead and use that one email, advocate@justdetention.org, we will put you directly in touch with Mona or Richard. And I just want to give tremendous thanks to Mona and Richard for your phenomenal contributions today, and to the work that you're doing. It's priceless, and so just want to say thank you for your work. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and this webinar will be archived, so you'll be able to listen to it again. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, everyone. And also, if you
Thank
have
you.
one quick moment, we have
please take
a
the
quick
survey.
survey for you all. If you don't mind clicking this link, it'll just only take you a couple of minutes, and it'll also be in a follow-up email that you'll be receiving in the next day or two. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to all our panelists, and thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you. Let's leave this up for a couple minutes, Christian, so folks can hopefully click on the survey link.
Got it.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye. Great. That should be good, Christian.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bye.
Bye.